is emotion. Therefore, the use of film, I say, putting it together and making it have an effect on an audience is, I think, the main function of film. Certainly, if you take dialogue in a film, truly you are only borrowing from the theater, which is what, as I've often said, most pictures you see are photographs of people talking.
Telescope. Brought to you by General Motors of Canada, makers of Canada's most popular cars and trucks, and Frigidaire appliances.
Tonight's Telescope, quite frankly, is an occasion for photographs of people talking. Happily, however, the man who does most of the talking is a man who long ago learned virtually everything there is to know about making motion pictures, silent and talking, and totally terrifying. In place of the introduction Mr. Alfred Hitchcock does not need, here's this message. Mr. Hitchcock, most Anglo-American film critics have always thought of you principally as an entertainer. For the French, however, you're considered a Catholic moralist. Do you think of your recent films as melodramas and thrillers, or as fables and even allegories?
Well, if you look at it from the point of view of melodrama, we know traditionally that that right must win over wrong. In other words, evil must lose.
Yes.
So that you could apply that to the basic melodrama, or you could apply it to, how should we say, a religious precept.
And you've said that you're more interested in the technique of storytelling by means of film than in the content of the film itself.
That's true.
Could you explain that a little more?
Yes, I can clarify it. Please don't think me presumptuous if I give you, say, the analogy of, say, a painter who paints a tree, a landscape, or even a bowl of fruit. I'm sure that the painter is not a bit interested in the apples for themselves alone, but in the technique of his work, which stimulates the emotion of the viewer of his picture. After all art is experience. People look at an abstract and say, I hate it. Well, the mere fact that they're using the word hate means that they're going through an experience, you see, and or they like it. Therefore, if you apply these principles to film, as I see it, it is not the pure manner of the content. In other words, it's not the story. It's what you do with it.
Not what, but how.
How. And therefore, I find that with many people, they look at a film and they look at its content only and never seem to study, I'm talking about the critical faculty, what was there in the film to make an audience go through these various emotions that you put them through, especially in my field, which is thrill or suspense or what have you. Sometimes one can almost say that the man who builds a roller coaster is an artist, because the grades and dives that he puts into it create the crudest and broadest emotions in the rider.
Well, let's go back down the years to the silent films of the early 20s. Since you were born in 1899, that period finds you in your early 20s also. Were you particularly interested in films before you actually became involved with them?
Yes, deeply.
They'd been a passion from your boyhood?
Oh, no question.
Well, As a writer and designer of titles for silent films, which was your first job in the film world, did you hope to become a director one day, or did that happen by chance?
Happened by chance. My earliest job, after being in the editorial department designing the titles, was being assistant director, and then I practiced my hand at writing a script. I did it on my own. I took a story, a novel, and eventually a job came up where I was going to be the assistant director, and they said, well, we've got to find somebody to write a script. Who's going to do the script? So I said, I'll do it. They read it and were impressed, and then I got the job. I was 23 then. And then my friend, who was going to be the art director on the same picture, found he couldn't come on this particular picture. It was a big, important picture. It wasn't a small picture. I said, I'll do the art direction, design the sets and so forth, which I did. And therefore, for about 2 or 3 years after that, I carried out the same routine. And then finally, I believe, I'm not sure, but I was told that the director of all these pictures was very jealous because I was getting credit for all this amount of work, and then he said he didn't want me anymore. So the producer said, would I like to direct? And I said, well, it never occurred to me. I was very happy doing what I was doing.
What was the first film you yourself chose to do?
My first choice was The Lodger. This is a book by Mrs. Belloc Lowndes about Jack the Ripper. The Lodger actually was a story in almost one interior. It was the landlady asking herself the question, is the man who is my lodger Jack the Ripper or not?
And I remember in that film one of your first uses of staircases for dramatic effect, the lodger's hand coming down the staircase.
Well, you see, those were substitutes for sound. Today we wouldn't do that. For example, have I got time to describe you how the opening was worked?
Yes, indeed. That's why we're here.
I took the first 10 minutes of the film to show a piece of news and a body being dragged out of the River Thames, and how the reporter picked up the information, got on the phone, and then I showed what happened to that piece of news in all forms: broadcasting, wire service, scintillating running signs, the newspaper office, and so forth. But each time I added a piece of information about Jack the Ripper. He only did it on Tuesday, only fair-haired girls. And I followed one blonde home to her house, and down in the basement, they're talking about it. And the lights begin to go down, slowly and slowly. And suddenly Mother says, Dad, put a shilling in the meter, the gas is going down. So Dad goes with a shilling to put in the meter. By this time, the place is in darkness, and there's a rat-tat-tat at the front door. Mother goes up to open the door, and she opens it, and Dad puts a shilling in the meter. You can imagine how the thing was quickly cross-cut. As the door opened, the gas came up, and there was a man standing with a cloak and a black bag, and obviously the Ripper standing there. And then later on in the film, I showed how he paced up and down the room. And I had the faces of the people below looking up to the ceiling of this agitated man. And I dissolved the ceiling away. I had a glass floor made.
Yes, I remember that shot.
Saw his feet going up and down.
His feet.
Then when he went out at night, you saw, as you described, the well of the 4 flights of stairs and only the hand going down. Well, today we would do sound. These were the resources one had to use as a substitute for sound.
Visual substitutes
for the sound in the silent picture days.
And The Lodger was the first film, wasn't it, in which you made a personal appearance?
It was in The Lodger, yes.
And that was simply because there wasn't an actor available at the time?
Yes, oh yes. We used to be able to hop in and do a bit if necessary.
Well, after The Lodger, was there then a consistency of personal appearances?
Well, the first big appearance again occurred in Blackmail.
And since Blackmail in 1929, which was the first film with sound that you directed, audiences have enjoyed seeing you pop up briefly and unexpectedly somewhere in all your films. Except for Marnie, the current Hitchcock production, the most recent example was in The Birds. Mr. Hitchcock, most critics have always considered Shadow of a Doubt, which you made in 1943, as your finest film.
Me too.
That is your opinion of it still.
Oh, no question.
In Shadow of a Doubt, of course, as in all Hitchcock films, your use of the camera has always been unique. The whole technical side of filmmaking, especially editing, has been a principal concern of yours. Would you be good enough to explain some of the basic methods in the cinematic approach to storytelling?
Well, you have two kinds of what we might call montage. I think we call it cutting. It isn't exactly that. Cutting implies severing something. It really should be called assembly. Mosaic is assembling something to create a whole. Montage means the assembly of pieces of film which, moved in rapid succession before the eye, create an idea. Of course, the most elementary form is the juxtaposition of imagery in various sizes. You know, a lot of people think that cutting is, or we'll say montage or assembly, is taking a man from one place to another and jumping into a close-up of him, which Griffith invented. It's true. But to me it goes much deeper. And as I say, the picture Psycho contained quite an amount of cinematic approach to this, to its basic content. In the first place, we had in it the murder of a woman in a shower, of a nude woman. Now, as you know, you could not take the camera and just show a nude woman being stabbed to death. It had to be done impressionistically. So it was done with little pieces of film. The head, the feet, the hand, the parts of the torso.
Shadow on the curtain.
Everything, you see, was used. The shower itself. I think in that scene there were 78 pieces of film in about 45 seconds. Now that's one kind. Now we'll take another kind, which I would prefer to call, say, the orchestration. Loud notes, soft notes, and so forth. The second murder in Psycho was treated quite differently. It showed a detective coming up the stairs, the audience already aware that a monster was around. So they were apprehensive for him, but they didn't know when it was going to happen. So I have this man mounting the stairs in what we would call a medium shot, a waist shot. And he gets to the top of the stairs. Then I take the camera and put it very, very high. Way, way high. Above the ceiling, almost. As though we're looking down on the whole thing. And a little figure runs out with a raised knife. And the hand goes up with the knife into the air and starts to bring it down. Now remember, these are two tiny figures. Then the next cut is a big head of the man as the knife goes across his face. Now, this is size of image put together to create shock. In other words, if it were music, it would be tremolos on the violin and suddenly a brass instrument, which is the big close-up. And from that he fell and went back. So there's an illustration of using the size of the image to create shock, or whatever you will. Now the third way is what one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up. Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees, and he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
Or you for it, as it were. Now, let's talk about some of the writers who've worked with you on the screenplays of your films. Among them, Thornton Wilder, Arthur Lawrence, Dorothy Parker, Robert Sherwood, Maxwell Anderson. Which kind of writer do you find best suited for creating a film script, the playwright or the novelist?
I would say the playwright rather than the novelist is more important, because you need scenes, playing scenes. There's people who are from the theater who can write playing scenes for you.
They've learned that compression and essential
compression
flow
is very, 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 very important. After all, who was it once said that drama is life with the dull bits cut out? So compression and economy belongs to the playwright. It doesn't belong to the novelist. You know, he can go on for 1,000 pages.
Quite so. Well, let us go on to further pictorial aspects of filmmaking. You first used color in Rope, I believe, and 10 of the 15 films you've made since then have been in color, though many producers seem to believe that a thriller should always be filmed in black and white. Which do you prefer?
I prefer color because there's plenty to dramatize in the color. By not using color until you need it dramatically.
In the same way, music is often valuable.
Sure, I think music's very good, especially when it's needed for silence.
The absence of it.
Yes, of course.
Obviously, you think very highly of the work of Bernard Herrmann.
I certainly do.
He's been involved as composer and conductor of the music in so many of your recent films. How do you and Mr. Herman go about examining the contribution of music to a film?
Well, I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, he does as he likes.
I'm brought in at the very beginning of the idea of the film. And by the time it has gone through all its stages of being written and rewritten and the final process of photographing it, I'm so much part of the whole thing that we've all begun to think one way.
But I've always found with musicians that you're in their hands anyway. What can you do? So very often I've been asked, not necessarily by Mr. Herman, but other musicians, they say, come down, I want you to know what you think of this. And you go down and you say, well, I don't care. If I say, well, we can't change it, it's all scored. So the next time you take good care to say, well, can you play me some and let me hear some of it before you go to the expense of an orchestra? Oh, no, you can't play it on a piano. It's not possible. So that there is no way to find out. So you are in the hands of a musician.
Well, Psycho is a very good example of the, if I might put it, the freedom with which Hitch thinks about music. Originally, the plan was, in our discussions, not to have any music over any of the murder scenes. However, I differed with Hitch about this and felt that music was needed. And when the music was recorded and we were dubbing the film, and we got to the murder scenes, we ran the scenes without music. And then I suggested to Hitch that I would like to show him the same scenes with music. And he said, I thought that we had agreed not to have any. And I said, well, we can have it that way, but at least listen to the way I feel about it and the way I've written it. So we ran it with the music, and he said immediately, we must have the music, of course. And I said, but you were against it. He said, oh, no, all I made was a poor suggestion. Hitch has his own world of film, and he's created characters and places and stories for it, very much in the way Dickens did. It's not a question of whether it is a real world or an actual world, but it's a world that has been imagined and realized. Dickens was able to do it through the page, and Hitch does it through this film. And although many of the stories that he has told are stories of our time, I believe the way of presentation and the motivating psychology is essentially of the period of Dickens and the great Victorian writers. Psycho is very much, for example, like a Wilkie Collins story. I think this is part of Hitch's great heritage as an Englishman, and one that he's been able to transmute and to carry forward in the world of the cinema.
Next week, part 2 of Telescope's talk with Hitchcock. Among other diversions, the Master of Mayhem will introduce us to Marnie, which is the title of his current feature film, starring Tippi Hedren and Sean Connery.
Marnie is the story of a girl who is a compulsive thief. And she does various jobs and then runs up against a man who falls for her, knows she's a thief, and engages her in his company, and he courts her. But he's a little disturbed when he finds out that she's robbed him as well. It's real sort of late Victorian Edwardian type of hero, you know. Very strong, very meaty. It's a very intriguing yarn.
Fletcher Markle for Telescope.
Telescope has been brought to you by General Motors of Canada, makers of Canada's most popular cars and trucks, and Frigidaire appliances.